Okay, this first video for 2017 is just an introduction to what is meant by aggregate supply policies and perhaps a little bit about why they're so important. So in this area of study, you're going to have to examine the role of aggregate supply policies and their aim in trying to achieve a macro environment that's more suited to achieving the macroeconomic goals. So you need to be able to link aggregate supply policies to our macroeconomic goals. We're going to look at ways that the government have tried to promote efficiency and competition, and also analyse whether the government should get involved in the market to try and boost aggregate supply. These are some of the key things we'll be looking at, as well as some of the strengths and weaknesses of aggregate supply. On completion of this unit, the student should be able to discuss the nature and operation of aggregate supply policies, so how do they work, and how they've influenced Australia's economic goals and living standards. They're the two key things you need to be able to do. How do these policies work, and how do they influence living standards? In this collection of videos for week 1, these are the two things we're going to look at: the nature, operation and aim of aggregate supply policies, their relationship to the domestic economic goals, particularly international competitiveness and living standards, and then the relationship between aggregate supply and an efficient allocation of resources. So first of all, a definition of aggregate supply is critical. So aggregate supply represents how much supply producers are willing and able to produce at any given price. And it's basically effectively the sum of all supply across the economy. So aggregate supply is about the total sum of production, so how much supply producers are willing and able to produce at any given price. The total level of supply within an economy. Increasing aggregate supply involves improving the productive capacity of an economy by increasing the amount of resources, or increasing the quantity of land, labour or capital resources, or improving the efficiency with which we use these resources. So boosting our productivity so that we get more production from a given level of output. So again, this comes down to increasing the quantity or quality of our productive resources. Aggregate supply policies, any measure designed to reduce the cost of production. Okay, definition of aggregate supply policies: any measure designed to reduce the cost of production or improve supply conditions for businesses. Okay, so when you're defining aggregate supply policies, any measure designed to reduce the cost of production or improve supply side conditions, and then for 2 marks I'll be providing examples. This can include reduction in business taxes, removing red tape or like compliance costs, measures that are designed to boost productivity or efficiencies, e.g. investment in new technology, so research and development concessions, depreciation allowances. It can also include trade liberalisation, labour market reforms, etc. The difference between aggregate supply and aggregate demand policies: that aggregate supply is about represents the total volume an economy's output at various price levels, where aggregate demand represents the total spending in the economy at various price levels. So one's the total volume of production at any different price level. Aggregate demand is the total level of spending at any given price level. And some key differences between how aggregate supply policies and how aggregate demand policies work. Aggregate supply policies work on the supply side of the economy and shift supply to the right from a basic level. They're about increasing the quantity or quality of our factors of production. So trying to increase either the amount of resources we have or how well we use them. They shift the supply curve to the right, and they allow for an increase in productive capacity, which allows for higher output alongside low inflation. Their design is to reduce capacity constraints so that we have better quality and quantity of resources so that we can allow for stronger growth without inflationary pressures. Aggregate demand policies, on the other hand, they work on the demand side of the economy and involve trying to get us to use more of our available resources by increasing demand. So increasing demand, which forces business to use a higher percentage of their resources. It's not about actually increasing the quantity and quality of resources. It's about using more of those resources because of an increase in demand. So some key differences: they work in different ways. One works to stabilise growth in spending. So one is about has more of a stabilisation role, about reducing peaks and troughs. So in a trough, rather than trying to increase aggregate supply, it's about trying to get people to spend more so that we can use more of our available resources so there's less underemployment. So think of it as trying to go from within the PPF to on the PPF, whereas supply side policy is about actually shifting the PPF outwards. So some key differences that you want to articulate clearly: one tries to stabilise growth in spending, the other one focuses on boosting our potential output. One deals with cyclical problems related to the business cycle. One of them deals with more long-term structural problems in the economy. So trying to solve things like, why do we have high prices because of cost inflation or high wage pressures? Or bad cost structures, so high prices caused by inefficiencies. It tries to reduce natural unemployment, so reducing structural unemployment by making sure that we're more competitive so jobs aren't going overseas and being outsourced, and trying to achieve sustainable growth, One's about cyclical growth, short term, one's about long-term sustainable growth. And they have different time frames. Supply side policies have a more long-term focus about strong sustainable growth in the long term. Demand side policies are about short-term cyclical variations in the business cycle. Aggregate supply policies are really important because they allow us to boost our productive capacity. They allow us to have enough resources to meet our growing population, so we've got enough supply to meet that increased demand. They allow us to raise our productive capacity, which allows for higher output at lower prices. That's really important, as well as boosting employment. By reducing production costs, it also allows firms to lower their prices without sacrificing their profits. So the overall aim is to alleviate capacity constraints by increasing our productive capacity so we can achieve more sustainable non-inflationary growth. Thank you.